Often, you hear it said that legitimate governments operate with the consent of the governed. Now, people could mean a lot of things by this, but one thing they sometimes mean is that the people have consented to the rule of government they live under, and therefore have some duties to obey that government. Social contract theorists like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau all stipulate that governments have the authority they have because individuals have agreed to submit to their rule. This idea of the social contract is both prevalent and yet also a little bit curious. After all, do you remember signing this contract when you turned 18? I don't. Americans like to point to the Constitution as a moment of agreement when Americans authorize their system of government. Even if we disregard the absence of African Americans, women, Native Americans from this agreement, it's not clear why the agreements made by your distant ancestors would bind you today. Normally speaking, you can consent to having things done to you, but you can't consent to having things done to other people, particularly not adults and particularly not people who aren't even born yet. So, alright, maybe we didn't consent to the Constitution, but maybe there are other ways governments can obtain consent. You might say that if a person doesn't leave his or her country of birth, that person is in effect bound by the rules of that country. Their behavior, in other words, implies consent. Now, this is what Socrates argued in the Crida. There are a few problems with this view, though. One is that love it or leave it presumes the authority of the person dictating love it or leave it to, in fact, force people to make this choice. Yet, it's precisely the authority to make people do things that needs to be justified in this case. This kind of argument can be summed up with an unsatisfyingly circular kind of sentence. The state has authority because it already has authority. Another problem is that for consent to be valid or morally binding, it needs to be meaningful in some way. Particularly if you're going to make assumptions about people's behavior and their silence rather than listening to what they actually say. If it's the case that the thing that you're consenting to is going to happen to you whether or not you agree to it, it's not clear how this is real consent. If you ask people to accept or object with the understanding that what they say doesn't really matter, then it's not clear whether their failure to object is really meaningful at all. If a government's going to claim authority over you no matter what its people say, it's just not clear how their continued presence in that territory constitutes any kind of consent. The government here is acting kind of like a boyfriend or a girlfriend who won't stop touching you no matter what you do. If you retreat into sullen silence because your objections don't seem to make a difference in their behavior, that doesn't mean you're consenting to be touched. Alright, so maybe you're going to get taxed and maybe you're going to get protection whether you like it or not from your government. But at least you had the opportunity to vote on how much you're going to get taxed and how much protection you're going to receive, right? A lot of people say, look, your opportunity to participate means you consented to the outcome. I think this argument is even more full of problems than the others have been. When is it just okay to go around imposing majority rule on people, right? I mean, if you go out to dinner with people and you don't all vote, for instance, on who gets to pay the bill, right? That just doesn't seem like a good, an appropriate way of settling matters among free and equal people. Another example, if we invaded and annexed Canada tomorrow, our giving former Canadian citizens the right to vote wouldn't really make Washington's rule over Ottawa legitimate in any way, right? For democracy to be legitimate on social contract theory, I think it really has to be the case that people already consented to the rule of the state prior to the election. Participating, but especially not participating, can't really be taken as evidence of consent to the state that set up the election in the first place. No matter the outcome, even if you win, you still haven't consented to the procedure. Alright, one final thing on social contracts. Contracts, normal contracts anyway, are always conditional and mutual. If one party doesn't perform, that usually releases the other party from his or her obligations to keep up their end of the bargain. If, as Hobbes says, government is required to keep people safe, or as Locke says, it's required to keep their persons and their property safe, it's hard to argue that the government really performs equally for all individuals. After all, no government has yet succeeded in completely solving the problem of crime. The question then becomes whether it's fair to say that those people who have been victimized by crime are now free to ignore the laws of society, because after all, the government does not seem to have lived up their end of the bargain, that is to say, keeping them or their property safe. So, making government a contract is probably a good idea. It's nice to think that our governments are, in some sense, authorized by us. But if our actual real-world governments have, in fact, the right to rule us, it's just not clear how they could have this right as a result of a social contract.